I asked him to turn on the microphone.
Looks like he should do it by himself. Oh,
now we got it. Can you hear me?
Hi, Jack.
I'm here.
Hello, nice to meet you. Hello.
I owe all of you a great apology. I am very sorry.
That's completely fine.
We've wasted your time. We
okay.
we have grandchildren in the neighborhood, and we were needed yesterday morning, and that just totally went right out of my head.
Yeah, that's completely fine. Thank you for joining anyway. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to be here. I put a big note on my mirror for this morning, 10 o'clock. So I would not forget.
Okay, so looks like the recording has started. Maybe we can start. So yeah, hello again, Jack. Thank you very much for joining us. And first of all, we really appreciate the hard work that you did. And we are really glad that we can chat with you here in live. A few operational things before we start. The recording of this interview will be available on YouTube via private and public link, and I will share it with you in a few days. And if we will have time, at the end, our viewers will ask questions in chat, maybe in Russian. I will translate them and I will ask them to you at the end, if we will have time anyway.
Okay.
And now maybe I pass the microphone to Vyacheslav and we can begin.
Hello, Jack. Greetings. Thanks for joining us. And as a little introduction before we start, I want to tell you that in Ukraine and Russia, you are famous in academic communities. So you're cited in doctoral thesis, researches and papers. Some
Really?
people some people call you an atheist, postmodernist, a neo-modernist, and so on. But for the broader Christian world, and you, in our channel as well, weak theology and its approaches are almost unknown. Mostly it's because of the non-confessional position of weak theology. However, recently there was a theological debate between two theologians of Ukraine, in which the dispute was mainly about weak theology, you as an atheist and believer at the same time. This discussion caused a huge, by our standards, a resonance and became the most popular discussion of the year in the Russian-speaking space. In this discussion, the components of weak theology collided with components with Balthazar's theoaesthetics. My subscribers asked me to talk more about you and your approach, which I did in several videos and Zoom discussions. And we finally, we invited you as the interest in your theology has only increased. So maybe my first question will sound like this. How do you see weak theology in the relationships with other Christian confessions like Catholic and Protestants and so on? Well,
first of all, I'm quite surprised to hear what you're saying. I mean, it's a tribute to the linguistic abilities of the Russian people who have learned enough English to get into what I'm doing. Because my English is idiomatic. You know, I make use of a lot of metaphors and a lot of, and I don't write. I used to write when I first started writing in a very academic way, but once I got tenure, I started writing more freely, and so my English is probably not easily translated, and it's a tribute to you that you all can get that much into it. My position, I think you would describe as the radicalization of an originally Christian position. That is, it is inevitable that when I speak, I am drawing ultimately upon a biblical and Christian horizon. You begin where you are, and you can't shed that. You can't, like Descartes, put the whole world into doubt and start from scratch. As a hermeneutic philosopher, I think we are radically situated within a context that you don't want to try to escape it. You just want to try to dig into it, dig more deeply into it, and examine what's what I like to say is what is going on in this cultural phenomenon. So culturally, I am a Christian. Even more specifically, I'm a Catholic Christian because I had a very thorough Catholic beginning, which is how I got into philosophy. In Catholicism, you have to learn a lot of philosophy to understand theology. And so I had my introduction to philosophy came in the context of theology. That being said, what I consider the distinction between theist and atheist and Christian and non-Christian to be cultural categories that there's something deeper than that. That there's something going on in those cultural categories that is really actually what interests me. And that probably the best way to summarize what that is what I call, following Derrida, the event. So there is a certain event going on in these cultural categories that is the subject matter of what I call radical theology. So I would make a distinction between confessional theology, like writing a book on the theology of the sacraments, a book on the Eucharist. Confessional theology on the one hand, and then radical theology on the other hand, which is the more, which is asking about this question of event. So I think confessional theology is what I call strong theology, and from my point of view, it's taking metaphors literally. It's literalizing symbols rather than understanding the symbols are symbols. And then, whereas radical theology is talking about what the symbols are symbols of, which is what I call event. Now, I don't want to create a new binary opposition by saying that, because then I'm back because I'm against binary oppositions. I don't trust them. I mean, they're sort of like what Wittgenstein calls a ladder which you climb and then you throw it away. I think, in fact, radical theology inwardly disturbs confessional theology, so that once you start examining a confessional tradition radically enough, if you dig deeply enough, you hit radical ground, you hit what I call the event. And the way you can tell that happens is that the confessional theologian usually gets in trouble. They say something that disturbs the peace of the confessional theologian. And at the same, but by the same token, let me just finish this part and then I'll shut up. I do run on. By the same token, in the same way that radical theology inhabits confessional theology and disturbs it, by the same token, if you didn't have the confessional theological traditions, there'd be no such thing as radical theology. You can't have a radical Jesus if nobody has transmitted to us the memory of Jesus. So radical theology is always a radicalization of something. And so insofar as there is an of something in me, I'm a Christian. Insofar as I'm concerned with the radical event that's going on within Christianity, I'm sort of post-Christian or post-theist or post-Catholic or like that.
Thanks a lot. Could you briefly clarify what you mean? What makes you a super-cultural thinker? If Catholic, Protestants, and so on, it's a cultural, difference? What makes you a supercultural thinker?
Well, I would not want to say supracultural, but sort of infracultural or radically cultural.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that Tillich uses this as this category of the theology of culture. So I think every theology is a theology of culture. I think that if I were Islamic, or if I were a Buddhist, or if I were a Hindu, what I would be radicalizing, what I would be looking into would be different. It wouldn't be the same thing. So there's no supracultural or transcultural thing going on here. I mean, it's not an Enlightenment idea of pure reason or religion within the limits of reason alone. It's nothing like that. It's the radicalization of the inner experience of a given tradition, and that tradition is idiomatically itself. It's not West. It's not Eastern. It's not Buddhism, and it's not. It's a biblical. I'm working out of a biblical tradition, and I'm not trying to get out of it into something above it. I'm trying to get into it and sort of feel its pulse. You know, it's like an oceanographer trying to hear, listen, sounding the deep. So I'm a sort of oceanographer of Christianity, trying to sound the deep resonances and echoes from the bottom.
Thank you. Here in Ukraine, most of theologians get you as something similar to Balthazar's theology of beauty. How do you like Balthazar's theology of beauty and theoaesthetics from your perspective? What are the differences between Balthazar's approach and weak theology?
Well, I think ultimately Balthazar is an Orthodox Catholic who is actually a conservative Catholic, whereas from Balthazar's point of view, I'm sure he would consider my view some kind of heresy or something, atheism. Because, I mean, after all, I do not think that the name of God refers to a being or super being or hyper being that exists somewhere. I think that's taking the symbol for confusing the symbol with what the symbol's symbol of. So I think that Balthazar has a far more traditional understanding of religious symbols and of aesthetics. I think for him, the beauty of the divine is emanating from the depths of the divine being. Whereas I don't think there is a divine being. I mean, I don't think there is a Trinity, and I don't think there is that Jesus was the Logos come down to earth. I don't think that should be understood in any kind of literal way at all. I think it really is an aesthetic, or I would prefer to say a poetic. Religion is irreducibly aesthetic, irreducibly a poetic. It is metaphorizing and parabolizing something. It's getting at something by way of narratives and song and dance and ritual and storytelling that is real and genuine, but it's expressing it in the form. It's giving it poetic expression. So I don't think theology is theologos. I think it's theopoiesis. So I think the ultimate difference between Balthazar and me is that he really is a Catholic. I mean, in the confessional sense, and I'm not.
Thank you. Do you see yourself It's a sort of continue of a previous question. Do you see yourself as a marginal theologian? Or do you think that weak theology someday will become a mainstream Christianity?
Well, I think that the confessional theological traditions are gradually going to have to face the fact that they are becoming progressively more unbelievable. I mean, the United States is a relatively religious country, right? It's religion is part of what's destroying it. Mm-hmm. But it is fast secularizing. The younger people in this country are by growing margins walking away from religion. There are the most recent statistics that I've seen show that about 25%, just about a quarter of the younger generation, under 35, do have no religious affiliation whatsoever. And they call them the nuns. I don't know if you know this one. This is an English pun, so you stay with me. When you fill out the census form, you indicate you mark off your religious affiliation. You say Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, whatever. And then the last category is none. N-O-N-E, no, none, no affiliation. Well, of course, none, N-U-N, is the name of a woman in a Catholic religious order, right? So the joke is that the nuns are starting to outnumber the nuns. The N-U-N-S nuns are disappearing, and the N-O-N-E-S are surging. So, why? Because Christianity, classical confessional theology, is telling a story that people find increasingly impossible to believe. If the church says on the one hand that Jesus there was an ancient, you know this, you're a trained theologian, ancient controversies about the reality of the body of Jesus. And the church wisely said, Jesus is not an angel who looks like a human being. Jesus is a human being. He has a real physical body. Good. But then you say he ascended into heaven. Right. Now you have a lot of back walk. You got to walk that back in some way or another, right? Because if he has a real physical body and he ascended into heaven, he is now in orbit somewhere. And he's dodging meteors. Okay, so if you go back to Baltimore and it says, well, look, that's mythology. We have to demythologize. And that, I think that's true. You have to demythologize the mythology in let's stick to Christianity. But then I say, well, you don't stop demythologizing, because then you'll end up with pure secularism. What I want to do is follow demythologizing with remythologizing. And that is to say, look, these are stories. These are profoundly important stories. You don't write off the brothers Karamazov because these are fictional figures. They are saying, novelists say profoundly important things that are deeply true, punishingly true. But we put the books in the fiction section of the library, right? Well, I think religion is true like that. It's true as a narrative, as a metaphor, as a metonym, as a symbol, as a poem. The kingdom of God in the New Testament is a poem. It's an imaginative exercise saying, think of what it would be like if God ruled, not the Romans. What would the world look like if God ruled? Mm-hmm. Not the Romans and not the priests. God, not the priests. So it's not, kingdom of God is not a theocracy. It's against theocracy. It doesn't want human beings running this thing. It's saying, what would the world look like if God ruled? And I say, with what is going on in the name of God, what would it look like? It would look like this. The last would be first, and the first would be last. The hatred would be greeted with forgiveness. What is that? That is a theo poem. It's a profoundly important theo poem. It's transformative. It's a magnificent vision of an alternate way to be that contradicts the ways of the world, of the powers and the principalities. Right? But it is not, it's not literally true. It's not literally true in the same way that novels are not literally true. And consequently, I think something like, to try to get back to your question, but something like weak theology, that I call weak theology, theopoetics, needs to evolve. That I think is part of the future. The other part of the future is that religion and Christianity have to take into account what's going on in artificial intelligence theory right now, which is nullifying the distinction between the body and the soul. I mean, if you still think that there's a real distinction between something called the body and something called the soul, which animates an inanimate body, you're living in the 19th century. And so the fundamental distinctions that classical confessional Christianity and other religious traditions too, really, Islam, that they've inherited, have simply been rendered obsolete. And you can't talk about the distinction between an inanimate body and an animating soul in the age of information. Human beings are some kind of highly complex information system. And probably the whole universe is some kind of profoundly complex information system. The distinction between matter and spirit, body and soul, time and eternity, these are obsolete distinctions. And theology has to deal with it, come to grips with it.
Thank you. Can I get it as you just gave us some directions or advice for people who are just entering the world of weak theology from strong theology, God?
Yeah, if I were a graduate student right now, I would write my dissertation on what I just said about information technology and the classical categories of theology. And there's plenty of work that's being done in that field. That's a growing field. There are people who are paying attention to this. I mean, there are theological possibilities here, and that we need a new theological imagination, right? I mean, there are theological possibilities here, and that is the way in which artificial intelligence is connecting you and me right now and constituting a virtual community is an operation of the, quote, spirit. It's spectral in Derrida's sense. It's spectral. So the virtual communication systems are indeed ways in which people can come together and form a kind of spiritual atmosphere around the globe. So we talk about the cloud. Well, there could be a kind of spiritual cloud, which would be a community of humankind. Now, what's that sound like? That sounds like Teilhard de Chardin, right? Teilhard de Chardin had a version of that a long time ago. So now, regardless of the merits of that suggestion, my point is that's the kind of thinking I think in which theology needs to engage in the future, and philosophy, not just theology.
Thank you. The next question will be: you have had the opportunity to hear criticism of your ideas for many years. So, what do you think is the most difficult to accept for your critics in your interpretation of theology?
Well, there's several recurring objections I've heard. I mean, first of all, obviously, the first thing is I do not. If the only categories when the census were theism and atheism, and there was no opportunity for post-theism. If I had to choose between atheism and theism, if I was, if somebody held a gun to my head and said I had to choose one of them, I would say atheism, because I don't think there is a being called God. Right. So I have a lot of my oldest friends, are many of them are Catholics. We all grew up together, and about half of them are still Catholics. So I hear a lot from, say Merold Westphal. Is Merold Westphal, do you recognize that name? Has he ever entered into those discussions in the Ukraine? Merold Westphal. He's a postmodern philosopher who is quite orthodox. So he just thinks of me as an atheist. And so I get that. I get that from a lot of people who think that this is simply atheism. And I say, well, it starts with a kind of atheism. Atheism is always relative to the idea of theos that you start with. Now, and so I think being atheistic about the God of classical theism is the beginning of radical theology. It's not the end. It's the end of classical theology, or a delimitation of it anyway, and the beginning of something else. So that's the first line of criticism I get, depending on where I go, depending on what neighborhood I'm traveling. The other one is something like what you were maybe hinting at when you use the word supra-cultural, namely that I'm trying to propose some kind of religion of pure reason, where that the distinction between confessional theology and radical theology is a distinction between a particular historical instance of a pure religion, which is a kind of enlightenment universal. So religion becomes a category of pure reason. Radical theology is a category of pure reason, and confessional theologies are particular cases of it, which is not the case at all. No, what I mean is to be doing a kind of deep hermeneutic of the confessional tradition that I've inherited. I don't think there is a thing called pure religion. I also don't think there's a thing called pure reason, which is another point. I mean, I think you can deconstruct this religious secular distinction because both of them proceed from the notion, from artificial notions, the idea of pure reason, pure religion. The other criticism I've gotten recently, which is a kind of a funny one, and that's one that has come from one of the young new, what's called new materialists, a man named Martin Hägglund, who is a Swedish philosopher who is teaching in the United States. H-A with an umlaut over the A, G-G-L-U-N-D, Hägglund. Have you heard has his name come up in your discussions?
No, not yet.
Okay. He comes after me from the other end. So I got people coming at me from this side of the hill, and I got people coming at me from the other side of the hill. His line is that I'm domesticating Derrida, that I'm turning Derrida into a religious thinker, and that I'm making him into a kind of Augustine, and that I'm an Augustinian Catholic trying to rescue Augustinianism from Derrida by turning Derrida into an Augustinian. So that's crazy, right? I mean, that's the opposite. That's the opposite argument. But a lot of the young materialists, a lot of young philosophers in the United States are what's called new materialists. They're not reductionistic materialists like the 19th century, but they're materialists. And so they want a materialist reading of Derrida, and they take me as the guy to argue against. That somehow or another, I'm actually trying to domesticate Derrida into a classical Augustinian position, which, is, and I wrote a very long, at first I just ignored that because I thought it was silly. But actually, this young man is quite smart, and he wrote a very, very good book about it, which unfortunately included a chapter on me and religion, in which he made this claim. So I can't ignore the book because the book actually has a lot of merit. And it's gotten a lot of attention. So I had to respond to it, and I responded to it in a very long article online, and then in an abbreviated version of it in a recent book that I just published.
If I will summarize, will it be correct that you claim us to step over atheism, to get through atheism, and some sort of post-atheism Christianity?
Yes. Or put it more affirmatively, post-theistic. Both. Okay, either one's fine. Post-theistic, post-atheistic. I mean, on this model, I mean, this is nothing new with me. This is exactly what Tillich would have said he was doing. He did say that's what he was doing. He said, to the notion of the, I'm paraphrasing, to the idea of the supreme being, the right theological and religious response, theological and religious response is atheism. But that's only the beginning. So yeah, post-atheist.
I got it. Thank you. Many of our audience can't read your recent article on prayer. We will provide the link below this video because it's in English. It's as simply as that. Could you please summarize it in a few paragraphs now? So the question will sound like this. How can the weak theologian pray?
Okay. Well, you know that, this is another criticism of radical theology. It's not directed at me in particular, but it's said generally about radical theology.
That sounds very often.
It's a very academic enterprise. It's for theologians, it's for philosophers, it's for academic conferences. It's a way to publish articles and write books and get a teaching job. But it has nothing to do with real people in the church. You know, it's strictly academic. Now, I think that's a half truth. I think it is certainly an academic debate. It is certainly a matter for intellectual back and forth. It's certainly a matter of thinking people can think about and argue about. Okay? And they should do so with rigor in an academic setting. So it is certainly an academic debate, but it's an academic debate about the very substance of our lives, right? It is, to put it in Tillich's terms, what we're arguing about is something of unconditional importance, unconditional depth, unconditional worth. And consequently, we're talking about things that stop us in our tracks and leave us asking, who are we? What's going on? What is this suffering? What is joy? What is death? And so it is deeply meditative. So it is, if you're just writing about this and not confronting it, not dealing with it, then you are like Hegel, what Hegel said. Hegel was talking about theologians who write about the history of theology. They don't get into what's going on right now. And he says they're like bank cashiers counting other people's money. Bank cashiers counting other people's money. Well, and I think that would be true of radical theologians, or any theologian. If all you're doing is an academic debate, then you're counting somebody else's money. What we're talking about here is a matter of ultimate concern, you know, of life and death. And consequently, it is a prayer, it proceeds from, it not only admits of, but it proceeds from a very deep sense of prayer. Now, they say, well, how can you pray? When you pray to God, you address your prayers to God, and you have you establish kind of conversation. But if a radical theologian doesn't think there's a being up there called God to pray to, how can a radical theologian pray? That's the question in the article. And I say, well, first of all, the notion that we address our prayer to somebody is important. It is from a philosophical point of view, a personification. Personifications are important. They belong to a poetics. It's a fundamental poetic trope. When something, think of somebody, imagine this. Imagine, say, a parent, long dead, or a relative or a friend who was very precious to you. Imagine you inadvertently come upon his or her watch. He or she loves this watch. You kept it all your life. And one day you open up a drawer and there's that watch sitting there. What you might very well start doing is talking to that watch, right? Or very precious plant that you've nourished in your house, or a tree that's been there since your childhood. We personify. Why do we personify? In order to strike a relationship to something of profound importance. Okay. So I think prayer is, first of all, that there's something going on in the personal prayer of confessional people, something deeper. I think what they're doing is addressing a kind of mysterium tremendum. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, I think that the best way to answer this question for me, which is what I do in the article, is look at Derrida's book called Circumfession. It's his reimagining of Augustine's Confessions. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, because he actually grew up in the land, the ancient Numidia, where Augustine lived and taught. Hippo, the city of Algiers is about 100 miles from the ancient city of Hippo. So he calls them his countrymen, his fellow countrymen. And he reenacts the Confessions, and he's talking to somebody. And you can't tell who he's talking to. Maybe he's talking to this Jeffrey Bennington, the guy you have to look at this book. He's talking to his mother who's dying. He's talking to himself. He's talking to us. And he's talking about the mortality. He's talking about love and death, mortality. Jean-Louis Chrétien, a French phenomenologist, just died about a year ago, said prayer is une parole blessée, a wounded word. Augustine's Confessions are a wounded word. Derrida's Circumfession, now he's playing with circumcision, confession, is still more wounded, because Derrida doesn't know that Augustine has a name for the one he's praying. Derrida does not. So that the word is even more wounded. So how can radical theologians pray? My answer is, how can they not? But it's not saying your rosaries, and it's not petitionary prayer, and it's not wanting to win the football championship. It's quaestio mihi facto sum. I have become a great question to myself.
So thank you.
It's inhabited by a deep prayerfulness. Springs from it.
It's kind of prayer after deconstruction of prayer.
Yeah, Derrida likes this without trope. So it's prayer without prayer. To a God without God.
Should we be hesitated about whether God exists and listen to our prayer or not?
Well, I think the question of God's existence is not a bad place to begin. Depends if you were born into a world where that question resonates with you, then yes, it's a good place to start wrestling with the question of with a religious question. But I don't think it's the only way. I think you could.
I mean, do we have to be sure that he's listening to us, or we have to hesitate it as our position for all the time? So I have.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, that's a symbolic way of speaking. Right? I mean, when you talk like that, you say, "Well, why am I talking like that? What's going on there? What's that issue when I talk? Is he listening to me?" Well, if you want to think about it in a sort of hardball way, nobody's listening to you. The stars are paying us no mind. They don't know where the stars do not know we're here. So in that sense, if you literalize that symbol, nobody's listening. Mm-hmm. But then the next question, so then should we just say, that's the end of prayer, that's the end of religion? No. It's like saying, are you going to, once somebody says, the real Hamlet, there actually was a Hamlet. In the 9th century, there was a Hamlet somewhere, some English, Anglo-Saxon warlord. Once somebody says, Shakespeare's Hamlet, there's almost nothing to do with the real Hamlet. You say, oh, well, that's the end of Hamlet. That's the end of Shakespeare. Is that what you're going to do? Well, I mean, that's how I treat this question of does God exist? And that is, look, the question of God's existence is the tip of an iceberg. It's a flashing signal, which is telling you something's serious that's going on there. What's going on there? It's not what's literally going on. In the same way that what happens in Hamlet, it didn't literally happen. The same thing's true of the New Testament. What's described in the New Testament didn't literally happen. That's not what's important. What's important is the story, the narrative, the poem, the imaginative production. What's going on when we pray to somebody?
So you mean that we cannot catch it by the words, so we can't describe that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we can't. We won't do a very good job trying to capture it in propositions. We won't capture it at all because it's something by which we've been captured. Right? It's got us before we ever want to get it. But there's a language which is sort of ham-fisted when you try to talk about these things, and that's the language of concepts, propositions, and arguments, the 3 component parts of logic. That can only get you so far, and, it's a preliminary use. But there is a language which is much more suitable for it, which can, I won't say capture it, but can resonate with it. And that's the language of literature, poetry, and symbolic language. So the poet, in the 19th century, the Romantics said that they weren't so much writing about the spirit, the world spirit, as the world spirit was playing on their bodies. Their poem was a song which was being played on their bodies by the world spirit, which is beautiful. And I think that's what theopoetics is. Something has got us. They didn't ask for it. People say to me, why do you keep talking about God? If you don't think there's a being called God, why do you keep talking about God? I said, I didn't ask for this. This is where I was born. This is me. This is the world I live in. And I'm trying to get to the bottom of it.
Thank you. We'll surely we'll read your article on that and getting more about it. So the next question will be about your private history. Some of the no, sure, I will find that. If in your work sometimes you refer to Bible and Holy Fathers, for example, Jesus that can heal some people, Jesus who can't resist the crucifixion, and so on. Do you think we can see some elements of weak theology inside the Christian tradition?
Sure. Oh, well, that's where I got it. That's where it came from. That's if you say to me, where'd you get all this? From the New Testament, from the scriptures. From 1 Corinthians 1. I have written 3 books that are taken literally. The words come literally out of 1 Corinthians 1. The weakness of God, the folly of God. Well, and then the third one is needs a little more explanation. The book that's called Cross and Cosmos that came out a couple of years ago. That's basically a commentary on the Heidelberg Disputation, Luther's Heidelberg Disputation of 1518, which is basically taking its point of departure from 1 Corinthians 1 about the foolishness of the cross. The foolishness of the cross is wiser than the wisdom of the world. The weakness of God is stronger than the wisdom, the strength of men. So, yeah, I mean, think of what I have to say as an elaborate postmodern, deconstructive statement of 1 Corinthians 1, where the folly, and this is what historically we know, that Paul's first reaction to Jesus was that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah because he got killed. He was defeated. God doesn't get defeated. The Messiah doesn't get crucified. And crucifixion was not just getting killed, it was getting humiliated. It was an honor-shame society, and a crucifixion was a horrible humiliation as well as that. And Paul's looked at that and he thought, that's not the Messiah. How could anyone think that's the Messiah? And then he has this breakthrough, symbolically represented by the road to Damascus. In his own letters, he doesn't mention the road to Damascus. That's the Acts of the Apostles. He wasn't riding a horse. That was the Renaissance painters who put him on a horse. All he tells us in his own letters is that he went off into the desert and he thought about this. And it hit him. But the divinity of God is manifest not in the strength of God, but in the weakness. And then the gospel portraits of Jesus, not the fourth gospel, but the synoptic gospel, portray this man of peace who recommends we treat hatred with love, injury with forgiveness, make the last first. All the virtues that Nietzsche would have considered weak virtues, slave morality. But Nietzsche was not completely wrong about that. It was a morality, what he called slave morality. It was a morality that identified God with the outsider, the outcasts, the losers. Ta meanta. Paul goes to Corinth. He's talking to a bunch of Greek intellectuals. He knows that they're interested in philosophy, which he thinks is vanity. And he knows that they like to talk about being. And so he says that he stands for Christ crucified, who identifies with ta meanta, the nothings and nobodies of the world. So, yeah, this whole thing comes out of a reading of Christian. I would say a reading of primordial Christian sources before they became a church And then before the Greek councils came along and it merged with Constantine, and you got one emperor and one doctrine, and it became, at that point, Christianity converted to the empire. It's not the other way around. The primal Christian spirit, I think I've identified, I think my book, The Weakness of God, identifies a primal Christian impulse.
Thank you. It's nice to hear you, but I want to ask you, were you're experiencing God as weak at the very beginning, or there was a critical point in your intellectual life that transformed you into a weak theologian?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, I wouldn't say it was a critical, no road to Damascus point, but no, I began in a completely traditional Catholic world. I grew up in a city neighborhood that was entirely Catholic, almost completely Catholic. I went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school. Then I entered a Catholic religious order for 4 years. And even when I left that order, I still was quite Catholic. In my early years in the profession, I was the president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. And for, the first 10, 15 years of my life, I would have been identified not as a deconstructionist or a postmodern or anything else, but as a Catholic philosopher. But all along there, I was never a conservative Catholic philosopher. Conservatives, I have a kind of visceral reaction to conservatism. It makes me, it stirs my anger. I think it's very reactionary, very fearful. So I was educated by relatively progressive Catholics. And then Vatican II, I was 22 years old when Vatican II opened. And so that was a Catholicism I identified with when I was young. Then I became completely disillusioned with John Paul II and the way he undid the reforms of Vatican II. And then I just sort of gradually kept studying more and more philosophy and teaching philosophy. And it just gradually hit me. I remember, here's the closest thing to a road to Damascus moment. I remember one time I was teaching a class, and I stopped in the middle of class and I said, you know what? I'm starting to sound like Paul Tillich. That is, I'm starting to say, don't confuse the symbol with what it's a symbol of. Which I always remember. Paul Tillich said, Tillich was a big hero of ours when I was growing up. He died in 1965. I was 25 years old when I was a graduate student when he died. And he was one of our intellectual heroes. And then he sort of, after he died, he sort of faded away. People lost interest in him. He's back now. There's a lot of young people who are quite interested in him. And I've gotten invitations to speak to young people who are interested in Paul Tillich. And he said two things about a symbol that I never forgot, and I always said really important. He said, first, if you understand what a symbol is, you'll never say it's only a symbol. People kill and get killed over symbols. Like take the flag. The second thing is never confuse a symbol with what it's a symbol of. Now, at a certain point in my life, I realized I'm starting to say things like that. He must be in my unconscious back there somewhere, and he's coming out again. And that happened when I was working on Derrida in the 90s, and I got to know him, and I realized he was very Jewish. He was deeply into. He grew up in the same kind of Judaism that I grew up as the Catholicism I grew up in, and then he became a graduate student in philosophy, and he dropped it. But it was there, and I realized he actually was engaging in a kind of deconstruction of his Judaism under the name of what he called the Messianic. Now, a deconstruction doesn't mean, doesn't mean to hammer it senseless. It means to reinvent it, release the event, which it is something harbors. And he was sort of reinventing a kind of messianic relationship to the world, to life, and of which is the Judaism that he grew up in was a kind of sort of the place where he found something he was rethinking. And at that point I realized I'm beginning to do something very similar myself with the New Testament. And but it was more of a gradual revolution. It wasn't a breakthrough movement. And Derrida had a lot to do with it. Derrida, I mean, there was a point in my life where I would have probably just dissociated myself from religion and said, I've washed my hands of it. But every time I did that, I would walk around the corner and there would be religion waiting for me. To say, it's about time you showed up. So every time I tried to walk away from religion, I just found out I was digging myself deeper into it. And then I finally figured out what's going on, and that's what I'm calling, what I called, first of all, the prayers and tears of Jacques Derrida. That was an attempt to say, theology has something to learn from deconstruction. And then after that, my books are not so much about Derrida after that, although I do write about it, but they're about God, the event that's going on in the name of God. And that happened in the 90s, I would say. So I was in my 50s. Up until I was 40, yeah, up until I was 40, I was still pretty much, in 1940, if you were interviewing me, right, 1980, you would be, I would be identified, you would have introduced me as an American Catholic philosopher. And that would have been true.
Thank you for your significant, in some sense, intimate story of your intellectual life. So can you name a person who is your, so to say, follower, adherent, someone who continues and develops the weak theology direction?
Well, there are, as you said, to my surprise and joy, there are a lot of young people who are working with this stuff that I'm very happy to hear about. And in the United States, it's like that. There are younger people. Two of the younger people who I wouldn't say are followers of me, but they're I think very important rising stars. In fact, they're stars already risen. One is Jeffrey Robbins, and another is Clayton Crockett. They're a couple of young, I think now they're 50. Let me think about that. Now they're in their late 40s anyway. But that generation who were students at Syracuse, and I went to Syracuse after I left for the University. There are a couple of people who I would associate myself with very closely. There are young people who are writing about my work. The best known people who know what I'm doing and have been drawn to it are Clayton and Jeff, I would say, in the United States anyway. There's another woman who's having a hard time finding a job who's done some very good stuff with me. Her name is Catherine Sarah Mooney, she's a English, British theologian, but she's having a hard time finding a job. But and there's enough people out there that are picking up this kind of work. There's a book called what's it called? Handbook of Radical Theology, Dictionary of Radical Theology. There's a young man named Jordan Miller who put together a kind of encyclopedia of radical theology.
Thanks a lot.
Books over there. There's a bookshelf behind me. It's over there. I think it's called the Encyclopedia of Radical Theology. The editor is Jordan Miller. If you look in that book, you'll see a whole bunch of essays about radical theology and about figures in radical theology. And that's sort of the terrain I inhabit.
Okay. Let me ask you. You mentioned an artificial intelligence. What is the consciousness in a weak theology worldview? Do you have a basis for a personality in weak theology, or these things you get from the other fields? What about the consciousness in weak theology, I mean?
Not sure I got that question. What about the problem of consciousness?
Yes. Consciousness is a thing that we all circling around. What is it? What is the consciousness? Yes.
David Chalmers, the American philosopher, calls it the hard problem. How do you get from these
unsolvable, right? It's not.
Well, we'll see. I mean, it's how do you cross the bridge from this complex neurological synaptic network to being conscious? And
can we assert that
looks like a quantum leap?
Can we assert that there is a consciousness inside us, somewhere inside us? Can we make an assertion?
I wouldn't want to put it that way. There's something inside us called consciousness, but consciousness is obviously some kind of effect. It's what you call an emergent property. So things have a property which is not all by no particular part has the property, but the network of parts, the system has the property. So consciousness is an emergent property of a synaptic network. And nobody has a particularly good explanation of, nobody has there is no received answer to the question of the transition from the neural network to consciousness. Now, what I would caution against is using a kind of God of the gaps argument there. You know how the God of the gaps are always looking for something science can't do. So it's constantly retrenching. Once upon the original version of the God of the gaps was an argument in the 18th century against mechanism that the human eye is far too complex for to be explained by a material process. So it must be God who made the human eye. God must have designed the human eye because it's too complicated for the rest of it. So that's not a good argument, right? So to go around saying consciousness is the new, now instead of the human eye, we're going to talk about consciousness and say that must be God, or that must be the soul. I would caution against that argument. I think that it is. I think it's an emergent property of.
I totally agree with you. At the end of our broadcast, let me ask you one more question. If you would become your own critic, how would your argument sound if you were your own critic?
What criticism would I make of myself? Well, that's a good one. I mean, I think that to some extent, I've gotten myself into unnecessary and unwelcome trouble by writing the way that I do. I think that you started with Von Balthasar, and I do think theology is theopoetics. Because I think it's theopoetics, I tend to write in a non-argumentative way. I tend to write phenomenologically. I would say, in terms of the categories of philosophy, it's kind of phenomenology. So I tend to write in a way that invites a lot of criticism. I mean, I just Cross and Cosmos, which I personally think is a very carefully constructed book, got really panned by an analytic philosopher who thought it was just wordplay. So there's a side of me that says maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I should write more soberly. So I can think of that kind of objection. I mean, if I had a really good objection to what I was saying, I wouldn't say it. So I wouldn't hold the position.
Yes.
I would hold the position I'm criticizing. I hold the critical position, not the one.
Great.
But that's a good question. That's a good question. Make a list of all your faults.
Great, thank you very much. I believe we've got so many insights from you, from your answers. It's very important for us to have a first-hand experience at the weak theology and your works. I have found particularly interesting how you carefully spoke about God, prayer, and hope. So we wish you energy, harmony, and good health, because we will continue to follow your new works and exploring deeper the world of weak theology. So thank you very much, and we will send you the video link with the subtitles.
Very good. Then I'll post that on my Facebook.
Have a blessed day. Have a blessed day. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Jack. Yeah. Bye.
We're still on.
Oh, do we have a time for one more question?
Sure.
I personally got one. Well, that's great.
After I stood you up yesterday, you certainly are entitled to at least one extra.
Thank you. Thanks. Did I get you right that you say that although that's a good concept of God of gaps, although we treat our human consciousness as a gap, that the thing we don't know fully, you still assume that the human consciousness can be completely a biological thing. So there's no way for God to form it or to relate to it. So, like, although we don't know what it is, we cannot say that it is like some divine sort of a result of a divine production.
Yeah, I have several reasons for saying that. One of which is I don't think there's any divine being to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I don't think that the name of God is the name of an agent who does things. Right? So consequently, I don't think that one of the things he did that nobody else can do is create consciousness, because I don't think there's anybody there to do it.
Okay.
I think the name of God is the name of an event, which is an event of hope and expectation and of memory, love, affirmation, but I don't think it's the name of a being who does things or fails to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I personally like how you said about that the possible future popularity of the weak theology maybe started from atheism. And I think that's a good thesis for a weak theology in the future, that it may be a theology of Gen Z and some other further generations who are not in a classic strong theology. I think it sounds there is a lot of hope in this thesis. So yeah, that's great. That's a good point and a good perspective that I get from this conversation. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. And I think the notion of mystery is not in danger. You know, the mysterium tremendum. You know, suppose religion, confessional religions as we know them, continue on their downward trajectory and more or less phase out over the course of the century or so. I don't think that the mystery of being, what the philosophers call the mystery of being, I don't think that's in danger. I think the mystery is taking a new form. And I think the question of consciousness is part of that, but the mystery of the universe itself. I mean, what the physicists are telling us about the universe itself is more and more becoming the mystery, the mysterium tremendum. We're stardust. We're a little stardust on a remote corner of the universe who says yes. Yes, we are the universe saying yes. And in a trillion years we'll be gone. The whole thing will be gone. But we will have said yes. So I don't think in that sense of mystery is going to go away. And that's what we're after. We're after that. That's the ultimate event, is an event of mystery. Being held in the grips of something which was up and running when we were born already, and which is going to be there to wave adieu when we go, which is the mystery of something rather than nothing.
Very theopoetical conclusion. Thank you. That's great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Be blessed.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.